horrifying cartel massacre has rocked Mexico once again. 20 mutilated bodies, several decapitated, were found hanging from a bridge or stuffed inside a van in Sinaloa, the heartland of the country's biggest drug war.
Southern border and what could be a stunning escalation in America's war on the drug cartels. The New York Times revealing tonight that President Trump has quietly signed a directive green-lighting U.S. military force outside of the United States. The target? Powerful cartels operating deep inside Latin America.
They thought they could take on America's best? Think again.
The title of this video isn't exaggerating. Cartel gunmen really opened fire on a U.S. fighter jet near the Mexico border, a move so reckless and ego-driven that it shocked even Pentagon veterans. They didn't just aim at an aircraft, but at America's war machine, and learned instantly that retaliation is immediate. But this ambush was only the spark, because what started as muzzle flashes in the desert grew into an all-out campaign of airstrikes, cross-border raids, mass cartel extraditions, and even the destruction of billion-dollar drug labs. Stay locked in, because the twists and escalations ahead will show what happens when fragile egos, military tech, and cartel firepower collide. It began as a routine patrol, a U.S. Air Force fighter jet gliding over the desert borderlands where cartel smuggling routes cut like scars into the sand. From the ground, it looked untouchable, a streak of steel, decades of tech ahead of anything the cartels could muster. But then, the impossible happened. From a hidden ridge, muzzle flashes burst into daylight. A squad of cartel enforcers armed with heavy weapons opened fire, rounds going up in glowing arcs toward the jet's flight path. Some shots went wild, but others came dangerously close, sparking against steel so visibly that the pilot saw it from his cockpit.
The visit comes just 2 weeks after President Donald Trump declared a national emergency at the southern border and ordered the deployment of troops to the region. The visit also comes as reports note that Mexican drug cartels are targeting Border Patrol agents with kamikaze drones and other explosives amid the border crackdown.
Until now, this game of chicken went like this. Trump was watching cartels, cartels were watching Trump, and both were low-key flexing their power. Except now, the cartels did hit first. Or, who can even say who's first? Trump says cartels need to go. Cartels are already angry after Trump designated them as terrorists and ordered a huge border crackdown.
And the criminal organizations have authorized the deployment of drones to target U.S. Border Patrol agents and U.S. military personnel.
So, yeah, this was no longer surveillance. This was war. In an instant, red lights screamed across the cockpit. Warning systems blared. The pilot banked hard, climbing for distance, but not before marking the coordinates and transmitting them to command. What the cartel fighters didn't know was that the moment they pulled the trigger, they had crossed a line they could never step back from. The jet wasn't just recording their positions, but was mapping their weapons, their escape trucks, and even their faces. And as that pilot climbed out of range, a second U.S. jet was already screaming toward the ridge, while Humvees rolled out from a forward base, because this wasn't going to end with sparks in the sky, not in the slightest. The pilot wasn't in survival mode anymore. He was in strike mode. In seconds, the location of the muzzle flashes, the shapes of men diving for cover, even the straight lines of a camouflaged firing pit were locked into his system. That data didn't stay in the jet. It was instantly transmitted to a nearby command center, which flipped the whole region from routine patrol to active combat zone. A second fighter jet was scrambled immediately. On the ground, Humvees rolled out of a forward base just miles away, loaded with special ops units trained to drop everything and respond within minutes. These were all the guys the U.S. government had prepared for moments like these, by the way.
Yeah, hey, Nicole. So these Reaper drones are on the hunt right now in Mexico. They're covertly looking for these criminal cartel organizations and their all labs. So what we know right now is that the president has promised to designate them as terrorists, but right now that is still something that they are mulling over and dealing with.
So it's an understatement to say they were well trained. The pilot armed his precision-guided munitions, not to blow the ridge to pieces just yet, but to scare the hell out of the shooters. With the push of a button, flares and warning bursts streaked across the ridge. The cartel gunmen panicked. Some fled, abandoning their heavy weapons mid-sprint. Others fired a few last defiant bursts before diving into pickup trucks waiting on the far side of the ridge. But the thing is, this wasn't a movie where the villains escape into the sunset. They were already being tracked, because when those trucks peeled off into the desert, every drone eye in the sky shifted to follow them, and that's when the chase began. From above, the fleeing convoy looked like glowing embers against a black sheet. A circling drone caught them on thermal, 3 trucks flooring it southwest through the desert. Special forces mounted up immediately. Every mile brought them closer to the invisible line where U.S. jurisdiction ended. But before the trucks could hit Mexico, the canyon trap was already waiting. The convoy swerved into a canyon road, their classic move, hoping to vanish under jagged cliffs where GPS goes glitchy and radios get patchy. Except this time, the U.S. was one step ahead. A pre-positioned team sprang the trap, spike strips shredding the lead truck's tires, metal screamed, and the convoy ground to a halt. The firefight was quick but ugly. Cartel gunmen tried to scatter into the rocks, but the drones overhead tracked every move, marking their silhouettes against the canyon walls. Within minutes, they were pinned down and forced to the ground and zip-tied. After all, it was much better than what they were trying to do to the soldiers. But that's not the end of it, because when investigators swept the abandoned ridge where the ambush had started, what they found made the whole thing even scarier. These weren't random assault rifles or rusty AKs.
The heavy machine guns were mounted on reinforced tripods. The ammunition belts were freshly loaded, and next to them lay a pair of shoulder-fired launchers. Weapons not usually seen outside of a war zone.
These were warlike weapons, not the kind Mexico made either. Forensic teams traced the serial numbers and confirmed the nightmare. These came from black market pipelines out of Central America. Weapons once meant for insurgent groups, now repurposed for cartels, which meant one thing: this wasn't just a border problem anymore. Someone outside Mexico was arming cartels to take shots at American fighter jets. Here's where it gets nastier. In Washington, the fighter jet attack triggered alarms in the Situation Room. The response seemed simple.
Southern border and what could be a stunning escalation in America's war on the drug cartels. The New York Times revealing tonight that President Trump has quietly signed a directive green-lighting U.S. military force outside of the United States. The target? Powerful cartels operating deep inside Latin America.
Behind the scenes, Pentagon planners began mapping out targets as if Mexico was Afghanistan. Bases, drug labs, even jungle compounds were under surveillance. As one report put it, military planners are already mapping out targets. That's an unprecedented escalation.
Earlier this year, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, when he was asked if the military could strike cartels, he says all options are on the table, and we are now getting closer to that. President Trump giving the green light to the U.S. military to strike drug cartels on foreign soil.
The ripple hit Mexico instantly. The CLRCUT investigation found Sinaloa operatives were suddenly panicked.
Cartel operatives have reportedly had to move labs to other parts of the country or temporarily stop production. Other cartel members are becoming more afraid of being arrested or even killed. One person telling the New York Times, "You can't be calm, you can't even sleep because you don't know when they'll catch you. The most important thing now is to survive."
Those were the words of a Sinaloa cartel operative to the New York Times. Yeah, you're right to ask why he'd speak to them in the first place. Reporters say that's all the more proof that they're panicking.
The pressure against some criminal groups appears to have ramped up since then. Mexico's security minister says there have been arrests and seizures every day. Last month, the Trump administration also designated 8 Latin American organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. On Friday, 29 Mexican cartel members were extradited to the United States.
Interestingly enough, so the cartel leaders were able to talk to the New York Times. They were able to find them. We should be able to find those leaders, and that is what is terrifying them.
Leaders were now torching safe houses, abandoning drug labs, and selling off assets. Sometimes their teammates, even their once untouchable bosses, were now hiding, using counter-surveillance gear and burner phones just to breathe. Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, had no choice but to flex. Nearly 900 arrests in Sinaloa since October, dozens of extraditions in just weeks. On February 27th, the government handed over 29 cartel figures, including legendary kingpin Rafael Caro Quintero to the U.S. Mexico's Attorney General said, "This action is part of the efforts of coordination, cooperation, and bilateral reciprocity within the framework of respect for the sovereignty of both nations." But the streets told another story, one that involved ever bigger piles of bodies. The truth was clear. The jet ambush didn't just backfire, but it cracked open a global war where the cartels, Mexico, and even Trump himself were now caught in a game spiraling out of control. While Washington debated military strikes, Mexico was already drowning in blood.
A horrifying cartel massacre has rocked Mexico once again. 20 mutilated bodies, several decapitated, were found hanging from a bridge or stuffed inside a van in Sinaloa, the heartland of the country's biggest drug war.
This was the visible fallout of a civil war ripping through the Sinaloa cartel.
Killings are the latest and most gruesome escalation in an internal war between rival factions of the Sinaloa cartel, one led by El Chapo's sons and the other by the son of imprisoned co-founder Elmayo Zambada.
On one side, the Chapitos, the ruthless sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, hungry to dominate the fentanyl trade. On the other, Ismael Elmayo Zambada's son, who inherited his father's network and connections. The feud began after Zambada's ally was kidnapped, allegedly by a Guzman faction, and flown to the U.S. under secret arrangements. The betrayal lit a vendetta that has already left hundreds dead in the last year, with estimates of nearly 3,000 missing in Sinaloa alone. Torture has become a ritual, a norm even, as cartel graffiti. Locals no longer speak of cartels as protectors, but as monsters consuming their own. A shopkeeper told Al Jazeera, "We're very tired of being among the bullets," while parents in Culiacan now check their phones every morning to see if schools can even open. Yeah, just pause for a second and think what it's like to be a kid growing up in these regions right now. And now, the whispers are spreading. Intelligence sources believe the Chapitos are forging an alliance with their supposed rivals, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, creating a super cartel with firepower and manpower unlike anything Mexico has seen.
Now with two cartels at war and a possible super alliance rising, Mexico faces a question no one wants to ask out loud. What happens when the monsters stop fighting each other and start fighting everyone else?
Yeah, it's not even hearsay anymore. Chapitos needed muscle, and El Mencho will take any opportunity to take over Mexico.
Yes, of course. In fact, Ivan Archivaldo, we already know this. It is even confirmed by the latest DIA report that came out just a few days ago, 78 days ago, that Los Chapitos made an alliance with the Jalisco Nueva Generación Cartel. From the position of weakness in which Ivan Archivaldo and Jesus Alfredo and their group now find themselves, they have had to seek the support of the Jalisco cartel.
Now think about how this game of tit for tat has been playing out so far. If the alliance did happen, then the jet ambush was just a spark compared to what's coming next. Just days ago, a New York Times reporter got to ask Trump firsthand about his most aggressive plan yet.
You were talking about sending military forces to fight against the drug cartels in Latin America. Do you think it's worth sending our forces, our U.S. forces there to take this on?
Cartels where?
Central Latin America.
Well, Latin America's got a lot of cartels. They've got a lot of drugs flowing. So, we want to protect our country. We have to protect our country. We haven't been doing it for 4 years. And we love this country like they love their countries. We have to protect our country. So, we're playing a tough game, but we'll have more to say about that soon.
Trump's words sounded patriotic on the surface, but that "they love their country's" line hit bad when you looked at what the cartels were actually doing on the ground. Hanging bodies from bridges, enslaving migrants, feeding entire towns into labs. This is hardly love of one's country, and the irony was that Trump's attempt to spin this as a moral fight only unlocked something bigger, because what came next wasn't just about drugs crossing borders, it was about America declaring cartels the same as foreign terror groups. Suddenly, this wasn't border security anymore. It was counterterrorism, the kind of authority once used to justify drone strikes in Pakistan or Yemen. News Nation reporters made it plain.
News Nation pressing President Trump on reports that he secretly signed a directive ordering the Pentagon to use military force against drug cartels labeled as foreign terrorist organizations. Groups like the Sinaloa Cartel, Venezuela's Cartel de los Soles, Trinidad, and MS-13. It's the most aggressive move yet in his war on the cartels, opening the door to operations at sea and even on their home turf. The Times says that military planners are already mapping out targets. This after Trump's earlier designations of several cartels as terrorist groups.
By targets, they mean bunkers in the jungle to cartel safe houses tucked behind city streets. That single burst of gunfire at a U.S. jet became Washington's excuse to escalate into open war, and Mexico panicked. President Claudia Sheinbaum, already under pressure from the endless violence, publicly vowed never to allow U.S. troops on Mexican soil.
Meanwhile, Mexico is responding to yesterday's NBC News report that President Trump is considering drone strikes against drug cartels there. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum says her country rejects unilateral U.S. military action in Mexico and that military strikes against those cartels, quote, would not resolve anything.
She framed it as sovereignty, a refusal to let her country be invaded under the banner of Trump's war, whatever the motive. But behind the scenes, her security chiefs weren't so defiant. A former Mexican special services officer told reporters that the United States could conduct a covert military strike without notifying Mexican authorities, and Mexico knew it. Better to quietly feed intel than to be blindsided by unilateral American raids. By March, the evidence was everywhere. Drone footage poured into Pentagon servers, mapping cartel compounds that had stood untouched for decades. Satellite eyes tracked convoys snaking through jungles, while intercepted calls exposed supply chains in real time. What once took months of planning by the Mexican military was now compressed into hours. And as all of this unfolded, one question spread in Washington. Is this still a drug war, or are we watching the first counterterrorism war fought against a cartel? And before anyone could answer, the Pentagon decided to show the world what that new war would look like. Cartels relied on mountains and jungles for decades. Nature was the only place that could hide their production labs from authorities. Mexican authorities have been tracking them for years.
So we're with the Mexican military right now, flying over the state of Sinaloa, over this massive expanse of rural land, looking for any signs of cartel activity. This is more cannabis than I've ever seen in my life. The scale of drugs here is just enormous. They're showing us what they've just discovered today, which is pretty sizable synthetic drugs lab. You can see this is where the cartels have been mixing the chemicals.
But with loud helicopters and so many officials in the cartel's pockets, most labs were abandoned or hidden in time. This summer, though, the soundless approach of 12 F-22 Raptors told them the gig was up. 12 GBU-39 small-diameter bombs fell in seconds, each locked to its target, with GPS accuracy down to 3 feet. 2 seconds later, the canopy was gone. The lab exploded in a chain of fireballs, igniting vats of chemicals and sending a mushroom of black smoke spiraling above the jungle. The Pentagon strike was surgical, a billion-dollar operation erased as if it had never existed. And reporters explain this is part of an ongoing mission.
They are adamant about finding these fentanyl labs, which apparently emit chemicals, and that's what makes them easier to find from the air and why they're using these drones. A source familiar with the matter told one news outlet that these recent flights were communicated to Congress using a notification reserved for new or updated covert programs that the CIA intends to conceal or deny. This, of course, signals an escalation.
So yeah, the cartel bosses thought ambushing America's fighter jet patrol was a show of strength. In reality, it was their worst miscalculation yet. Word spread through encrypted cartel comms within hours. They know where we are. However, while Mexico celebrated arrests and Washington claimed victory, a darker twist was already forming, one that would prove the war was far from over. In one night, it extradited 29 major drug lords to the U.S., including Rafael Caro Quintero, the man behind DEA agent Kiki Camarina's murder, and Vicente Carrillo Fuentes of the Juarez Cartel.
Dangerous cartel kingpins, responsible for decades of flooding drugs and violence throughout multiple countries. They will face the consequences of their action.
It was historic, sure, but it was also a message meant to calm Trump's threats of tariffs and strikes. Border towns cheered, families poured back into parks, and shopkeepers reopened without fear of extortion. But everyone knows the relief is not forever, because both sides of this war were built on fragile egos. Cartel bosses can't stand being humiliated, and Trump can't stand being defied. So escalation will only lead to more escalation, a cycle with no brakes. Plus, if Trump's invading Mexico, why wouldn't Mexican cartels invade the US? And here's the real danger. By dragging Mexico and other Latin American countries deeper into this fight, Trump isn't just poking the cartels, he's risking retaliation at a scale the US might not be ready to carry. The cartels thought firing at a fighter jet would send a message. Instead, they awakened a war machine. Now the question is burning on both sides of the border. Will either Trump or the cartels survive the devil they just picked a fight with? Or will the fire consume them all? And where do we stand, watching it all go down?